Welcome to White Shadows. Today I bring you the scariest and bone-chilling stories from the graveyards of USA. Hold your pillow tight, turn on the light, put on your earphones. So here it goes. New Orleans is known for its vibrant history, its rich culture, and its eerie atmospheric charm. But nothing embodies this more than the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, one of the oldest and most infamous burial grounds in the city. Its decaying tombs, crooked grave markers, and haunted past are the stuff of legend. They say if you listen closely, you can hear whispers in the wind, see shadows move in the corners of your eyes, and feel the unmistakable presence of the long-departed. But on one moonlit evening in 1983, a group of thrill-seekers found out just how terrifying the cemetery truly could be. It was a group of 5 young college students, all eager to test their courage and experience the supernatural up close. They had heard the rumors, of course. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 was infamous for being the final resting place of some of the city's most notorious residents, like the voodoo Queen Marie Laveau. Her tomb, a sight in itself, was said to be cursed, drawing visitors who left with more than they bargained for. As the group entered the cemetery, the air seemed to grow colder. The city's noise, the sounds of the streets, faded away, leaving an eerie silence in its place. The only sound was their footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional creak of an old, weathered tombstone as it shifted in the ground. "Let's go find Marie Laveau's tomb," said Jason, the most fearless of the group. He had read all about the supposed curse and was itching for a supernatural encounter. The others, though apprehensive, followed. They didn't believe in ghosts, or at least not enough to be scared of some old tombs. The cemetery was a tourist attraction after all, but the deeper they walked into the grounds, the heavier the atmosphere seemed to become. It wasn't just the isolation, they felt like they were being watched. After some time, they found her tomb. It was exactly as they had heard, a simple stone structure, covered in old, faded markings, with candles left by visitors, offerings placed in front of it. The air here felt charged, as though someone was waiting. "Should we knock on the tomb 3 times, like they say?" asked Kelly, her voice trembling slightly. She was usually the skeptic, but something about the place unnerved her. Jason, ever the instigator, grinned. "What's the worst that could happen?" With that, he stepped forward and knocked on the tomb 3 times, his hand rapping against the cold stone. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder by the second. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world, an unnatural, vibrating noise that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The group froze. They could feel it now. The presence. It was as if something was pushing against their chests, squeezing the air from their lungs. Jason turned, but the other members of the group were already backing away, their faces pale, eyes wide. "You heard that, right?" Kelly whispered. Her voice was shaky. Her face was ghostly white, her breath coming out in short, shallow gasps. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but then, too late, he felt it. A cold hand grasped his shoulder from behind. He spun around, but there was no one there. And then, the shadows seemed to deepen, swirling in unnatural patterns across the graveyard. A figure appeared before them, materializing from the darkened corner of the cemetery, its shape more of a silhouette than a body. A woman's form, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face obscured by a veil. Her presence was oppressive, almost suffocating. Her lips did not move, but they could all hear her voice. It was soft, melodic, but full of warning and cold malice. "You should not have come here," she whispered. "This place is not for the living." In an instant, the group was paralyzed. It was as if they could no longer move, their bodies frozen by an invisible force. They were powerless. The figure drifted toward them, the air around her growing colder with each step. Her eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black pits, endless voids that seemed to suck the life from the air around them. Jason tried to scream, but no sound came out. His heart pounded in his chest, a deafening rhythm that seemed to echo in the tombs surrounding them. The others struggled against the force, but it was no use. They were trapped in a bubble of terror. "You have disturbed my resting place," the figure said, her voice now louder, the words dripping with venom. "And now you will pay." Suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath them, and the tombs around them seemed to shake as if the very earth was alive. From the cracks in the ground, skeletal hands emerged, reaching for their ankles, pulling at their feet. Kelly screamed as cold, bony fingers wrapped around her legs, dragging her toward the earth. She kicked and clawed at the dirt, but the grip was unyielding. "Help! Jason, help!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the eerie stillness that had descended upon the cemetery. But Jason couldn't move. He could only watch in horror as his friends were dragged into the earth, disappearing into the dark soil. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. His eyes were locked onto the figure, the ghostly woman, who now stood over him, her veil lifting to reveal a face twisted with anger and ancient rage. "You will never leave," she whispered again, her voice colder than death itself. In that moment, Jason understood. The spirits of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 did not welcome the living. They wanted them to stay forever. The world around him went black. The next morning, a lone tour guide led a group through St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. She passed by the tombs and pointed out their histories, speaking of Marie Laveau and other notable figures. But there was no mention of the 5 college students who had entered the cemetery the night before, because they were never seen again. Get ready for the next one. It has horrors in the air that you can't resist. In the heart of Boston, just a short distance from the bustling streets of the city's historic district, lies the Granary Burial Ground, one of the oldest cemeteries in America. With its ancient gravestones, crumbling markers, and eerie stillness, it holds the remains of some of the city's most famous citizens, including Paul Revere, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams. But what most people don't know is that the Granary Burial Ground harbors something far darker than the names etched into its tombstones. It was a brisk autumn evening in 1992 when a small group of history enthusiasts, obsessed with the haunted history of Boston, decided to take a nighttime tour of the Granary Burial Ground. They had heard the stories of the restless spirits that roamed the cemetery, the whispers that followed those brave enough to walk its grounds after dark. But they didn't believe in ghosts, at least not enough to be afraid of them. The group, for friends Tom, Melissa, Jason, and Liz, had decided to take a special after-hours tour of the cemetery to explore its darker past. Their guide, an elderly man named Edward, was a local historian with a deep knowledge of the graveyard's history and the tragedies that had occurred there. Just so you all know, Edward had warned them at the start of the tour, his voice low and serious. The Granary Burial Ground isn't like other cemeteries. It's seen its fair share of bloodshed, and there are some spirits here that don't take kindly to visitors. Melissa laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just an old cemetery. What could go wrong?" Edward's face remained stoic, his eyes narrowing. "You would be wise to respect the spirits here, especially the ones buried in the far corner." He didn't elaborate, and the group, still skeptical, followed him deeper into the cemetery. As the group walked through the gravestones, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds, and the wind began to pick up, making the dry leaves swirl around them. The faint sound of distant footsteps echoed behind them, but when they turned to look, no one was there. The cemetery, despite its age, was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the branches above. They finally reached the far corner of the cemetery, the area Edward had mentioned. It was isolated, far away from the more prominent figures resting in the center. The gravestones here were older, some even cracked and toppled over. The air was colder in this part of the cemetery, and a strange heaviness seemed to settle over the group as they stood near a particular gravestone. A simple stone marker with no name, only a blood-red stain that seemed out of place, despite the years it had been weathered. This Edward said in a voice barely above a whisper, is where the victims of the Boston Massacre are buried. The massacre was an event that had occurred in 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonists, killing 5 people in cold blood. It was a moment of immense tragedy, one that still haunted the city's history. But Edward's words didn't quite capture the depth of what had happened here. The bloodshed wasn't just limited to the massacre. There had been stories over the years of restless spirits seeking vengeance for their untimely deaths. But there was one story that the old man hadn't told them, one that they would soon experience firsthand. Without warning, the wind suddenly died down. The silence was so intense that it felt as though the entire cemetery had held its breath. And then a voice, a low, guttural murmur, emerged from the darkness. "Leave this place." The group froze. The voice wasn't coming from Edward. It wasn't coming from any of them. It was a voice of a man, hoarse and desperate, as though he had been calling for help for centuries. The chill in the air intensified, and the one-still leaves began to rustle violently, as if swept by an invisible force. "Did you hear that?" Liz asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, a shadow appeared, slowly rising from the ground near the gravestone. It was an indistinct figure at first, just a dark shape, but as it grew closer, the group could make out the details. It was a soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied, his face gaunt and hollow, eyes sunken into a face that had been twisted by pain and anguish. The ghostly soldier reached out toward them with skeletal hands, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. His eyes bore into them with an intense, unfathomable sorrow. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. But the group didn't feel relief. They felt something far worse, an overwhelming sense of dread, as though they were being hunted. And it was then that they realized this wasn't the only spirit in the cemetery. From all around them, the shadows seemed to come alive. Figures, disembodied, half-decayed and twisted, rose from the earth, their movements jerky and unnatural. Faces of the fallen soldiers, the innocent victims of the massacre, appeared from the mist, their bodies bloodied and mangled, their eyes locked in eternal terror. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and suddenly, the gravestones themselves seemed to crack open, as though the earth was trying to swallow them whole. "Run!" Edward screamed, but it was too late. The spirits closed in, their mournful wails filling the air. It wasn't just the sound of death. It was the sound of souls who had been trapped for over 200 years, souls who had never found peace, souls who were hungry for vengeance. Tom turned to run, but his feet seemed to sink into the earth, as though the ground itself was holding him back. He looked down, his eyes wide with terror, to see skeletal hands rising from the soil, gripping his ankles with inhuman strength. The others were screaming now, but their voices were drowned out by the growls and shrieks of the ghosts surrounding them. Jason tried to pull Tom free, but as he reached out, a cold hand grabbed his arm, pulling him into the ground. His body convulsed as he was dragged beneath the earth. The last thing he saw was the twisted faces of the massacre victims staring up at him with hollow eyes. And then, the cemetery fell silent once more. The next morning, when the authorities arrived to investigate the disturbance in the Granary burial ground, they found nothing. No signs of the group, no evidence of their presence. Just the same ancient gravestones and the eerie stillness of the cemetery. The blood-red stain near the gravestone of the massacre victims had vanished, leaving no trace of the horrors that had transpired the night before. But some say that if you visit the Granary burial ground at night and stand in the far corner, you might hear the faint cries of those lost souls, still wandering in search of peace, and seeking to claim new victims to join them in the grave. Don't leave the room now. Get ready for the last one. In the heart of Nashville, tucked away among the darkened streets of an older part of the city, lies the infamous Nashville City Cemetery. It's a place marked by time, neglect, and a history that's far darker than anyone could imagine. Established in the 1820s, it is the final resting place of many of the city's early settlers, some of whom were prominent figures in Nashville's development. But there are others who lay forgotten, their stories untold, buried beneath layers of dirt, stone, and the veil of time. However, what no one speaks of in polite conversation is the darker side of the cemetery's past, a side that has left many to wonder if the souls within the graveyard have ever truly rested. In 1965, a young couple, David and Rachel, decided to explore the cemetery after hearing rumors of strange occurrences at night. They were thrill seekers, always up for a challenge, and the idea of spending a night in the Nashville City Cemetery was too tempting to pass up. They'd heard whispers about flickering lanterns at midnight, the sound of distant chanting, and shadowy figures wandering among the tombstones. It was a part of town known for its old legends, and they were eager to test whether there was any truth to them. Despite warnings from locals who spoke in hushed tones about the curses placed on the cemetery, David and Rachel made their way to the gates one chilly fall night. Just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the cemetery stood before them, ancient and imposing, a maze of weathered stones stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was thick, and an unnatural fog began to settle in, creeping through the gates and curling around the tombstones like a living thing. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked, her voice faltering slightly. She wasn't one for superstition, but the oppressive atmosphere of the cemetery unnerved her. David, ever the skeptic, grinned. "We're here. What's the worst that could happen?" They crossed the gates and ventured deeper into the cemetery, the weight of history pressing down on them with each step. As they walked, the wind began to pick up, sending leaves rustling and causing the branches of the trees to creak above them. The deeper they went, the more isolated they felt. There was no sound beyond the wind. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, absolute quiet that seemed to hold the cemetery in a suspended state of timelessness. After a while, they came across a particularly old section of the cemetery where the tombstones were crooked, leaning in unnatural angles. The air was colder here, and the fog had grown so thick that it almost felt as if the very earth itself was suffocating them. They stopped at a grave that looked older than all the others, its stone cracked and covered in a strange, dark moss. "This place feels wrong," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper. David looked at her, the amusement fading from his face. He was starting to feel it too. Something was off about this place. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, as though the cemetery was holding its breath. He felt as though they were being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "I think we should go," Rachel said, her voice shaking now. But just as she turned to leave, something stopped her. A figure, standing at the far end of the cemetery. It was tall and hunched, its face obscured by shadows. The figure was unmoving, as if it had been waiting for them. Rachel gasped, and David followed her gaze, his stomach turning as he saw the outline of the figure in the fog. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be, but there was something wrong about the way it stood, an unnatural stillness about it. "Who's there?" David called out, his voice more uncertain than he intended. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly started to move toward them. It didn't walk, it glided, as if floating just above the ground. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. The closer it got, the more grotesque it appeared. Its skin was pallid and stretched thin, like it had been left to rot for years. Its eyes, when they finally met David's, were empty black pits, nothing but darkness. Suddenly, Rachel screamed. From the figure, a voice, low, guttural, like the scraping of nails against stone, spoke. "You shouldn't have come." David's heart raced, but his body refused to obey. He felt as though the ground had become sticky, as though the very earth was trying to hold him in place. He reached out for Rachel, but she was already backing away, her eyes wide with terror. The figure drew closer, its presence overwhelming. "You should leave, now." The voice growled again, louder this time, filled with malice. Before David could react, he heard a sound, something behind him. He turned. only to see more figures, more twisted, decaying shapes, emerging from the fog. They were everywhere now, surrounding them, filling the cemetery with an impossible number of souls. The figures were not human, not anymore. They were something else. Vessels for the tormented spirits that had never found peace. Rachel grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the cemetery's exit, but the fog was thick and the figures were closing in. The cemetery had become alive with the dead, their tortured faces contorted in agony. They ran, or at least tried to. The fog made it impossible to see clearly, but David could feel something chasing them, something far worse than anything he had ever imagined. There were whispers now, a chorus of voices all around them, speaking in a language they couldn't understand, a language of curses and hatred. "Help!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking. But the cemetery had no mercy. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of twisted paths and endless rows of tombstones. It was as though the cemetery itself had changed, trapping them inside. They could feel cold hands brushing against their skin, could hear the sound of ragged breathing in their ears. They turned a corner, only to find themselves face to face with the figure once again. Its mouth opened, revealing a gaping, dark void where its throat should have been. It hissed at them, a sound like the scraping of nails against a chalkboard. "Run or stay forever," the figure whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. David looked at Rachel, and in that moment, he realized the truth. They were never meant to leave. The spirits here weren't just restless. They were angry, and they were hungry. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, and a skeletal hand shot out, grabbing Rachel's ankle. David screamed as he tried to pull her free, but the hand was too strong, pulling her into the earth with a violent jerk. "No!" David cried, but his voice was lost in the roar of the wind and the shrieks of the spirits. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the fog lifted. The cemetery stood quiet once more, the figures gone, as if they had never been there at all. The morning sun began to rise over the tombstones, casting a soft, golden light over the graves. But David was gone. The next morning, when the authorities arrived, they found the cemetery empty. No sign of David and Rachel. No footprints. No traces of their presence. Only the faintest hint of fog lingering in the air, as if the night's horrors had never truly ended. But some say that if you visit the Nashville City Cemetery at night, you can still hear the faint whisper of tortured souls. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the agonizing cry of someone who tried to leave, but never did.